It is a little after 8 o'clock on the morning of May 20th, 1941, and the sky above the olive groves west of Canea has turned the color of a bruise. Dust rises in columns where the bombs have already fallen. Down among the marquees and canvas wards of the 7th General Hospital, orderlies are still moving between stretchers when the drone overhead changes pitch. Painted clearly on 3 rooftops and staked out in a vast rectangle of white and red cloth on the open ground nearest the sea, is the one symbol that every combatant nation on Earth has sworn, on paper at least, to respect. It cannot be mistaken for anything else. And yet the aircraft do not turn away. What happens over the next few hours on that stretch of Cretan coastline will become one of the most contested episodes of the entire Mediterranean campaign, an event that exposes, in the starkest possible terms, how quickly the rules of war can be discarded when an army is losing. This is the story of how the Red Cross emblem, the one piece of cloth meant to place the wounded and their carers beyond the reach of battle, was ignored on Crete, and of the men who found themselves defending a hospital with rifles instead of stretchers because the symbol above their heads had stopped meaning anything at all. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand what the Red Cross on a white field was supposed to guarantee. The Geneva Convention for the Amelioration of the Condition of the Wounded and Sick in Armies in the Field had been signed in 1929 and ratified by Germany in 1934. Its central bargain was simple, almost naive in its optimism. Mark your hospitals, your ambulances, your medical staff, clearly and unmistakably, and the enemy will leave them alone. In the industrialized slaughter of the previous war, that promise had held, however imperfectly. Millions of men on both sides had trusted their lives to a strip of red cloth. By May 1941, on a Greek island most of the world had never heard of, that trust was about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. The wider problem facing the defenders of Crete had almost nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with intelligence and improvisation. Around 40,000 British, Commonwealth, and Greek troops, many of them recently and chaotically evacuated from the mainland after the collapse in Greece, were dug in across an island the Allied High Command had barely had time to properly organize. Major General Bernard Freyberg, the New Zealand commander of what was known as Cree Force, had powerful intelligence in the form of decrypted German signals traffic, but the picture it painted had to be disguised, diluted, and second-guessed to protect the secret of how it had been obtained. The result was a defense that was, in places, alert and well-prepared, and in others, thin, exhausted, and badly supplied. Medical facilities were stretched across this uncertain terrain in the same makeshift way as everything else. The 7th General Hospital sat west of Canea, a scattered collection of buildings, marquees, and smaller tents spread over open ground, with a further New Zealand field ambulance unit and a dressing station nearby. On paper, the area was unambiguous. This was a protected medical zone, and international law said so in terms that admitted no argument. German intelligence, however, had spent weeks badly underestimating the size of the force it was about to attack. Planners in Athens believed Crete was lightly held, and that belief shaped everything that followed. It appears the Luftwaffe's briefings simply had not accounted for the presence of 2 tented hospitals and a dressing station clustered together in the Canea sector, because nobody had told them there were enough troops on the island to need them. Whether through that failure of intelligence, through the chaos of a battle already going badly wrong for the attackers, or through a harder and darker calculation about what could be justified once German paratroopers began taking catastrophic losses, the marked hospital area became, within hours of the invasion beginning, a target rather than a sanctuary. There is a further layer of context that makes the failure at Canea all the more striking. Freyberg's men had known an attack was coming. Decrypted German signals traffic, filtered down through channels designed to conceal that the source was broken code rather than local espionage, had given the defenders real warning of the shape and timing of the assault. That advantage, extraordinary by the standards of the time, ought to have translated into a well-prepared defense. In practice, it was blunted by an island that offered few good roads, by units that had arrived from the Greek mainland with little more than the equipment they carried on their backs, and by a chain of command spread thin across three widely separated airfields at Maleme, Rethymno, and Heraklion. Medical facilities inherited the same improvisation as everything else. A general hospital in this context was not a solid, permanent building bristling with defenses. It was canvas and timber and painted cloth, sited where the ground allowed and marked in good faith according to a set of international rules that nobody expected to be tested quite so soon or quite so violently. The men who came down on the hospital that morning belonged to 3rd Battalion of the German 3rd Parachute Regiment, part of Major General Kurt Student's 11th Air Corps, the force spearheading Operation Mercury, the first large-scale airborne invasion in the history of warfare. It is worth pausing on just how experimental and desperate this entire operation was. German paratroopers jumped with their rifles and heavier weapons in separate canisters, meaning that for the first, most vulnerable minutes on the ground, many were armed with nothing more than a pistol and a knife while they searched the ground for their equipment containers. Losses among the parachute regiments in the opening hours of the invasion were catastrophic. Entire companies were cut down in the olive groves around Malem and Galatas before they ever reached their objectives, with some units losing the majority of their men within the first hour of landing. This is the context in which the assault on the hospital took place, not a calm, deliberate operation by a confident army, but a chaotic, costly, close-quarters fight by men who had just watched a third or more of their comrades die around them within minutes of landing. Students' whole concept for Operation Mercury depended on speed and shock, on seizing the island's airfields within the first day, so that transport aircraft could begin ferrying in mountain troops as reinforcements before the Royal Navy or an organized counterattack could respond. Nothing about the plan anticipated the ferocity of the reception the paratroopers would receive from New Zealand, Australian, British, and Greek defenders who, thanks to that broken code, were far better prepared than German intelligence believed possible. By mid-morning on the first day, entire battalions earmarked for the capture of key objectives around Canea had been effectively destroyed as fighting formations, their survivors scattered in small, isolated pockets, fighting for their lives rather than advancing according to plan. It was into this collapsing, improvised battle, not a tidy staff exercise, that the 3rd Battalion's advance towards the hospital area took place, and it is against that backdrop of chaos and heavy loss that any assessment of intent behind the attack has to be weighed. Whatever the precise mixture of confusion and calculation behind it, the outcome on the ground was unambiguous. The hospital area, plainly marked with the emblem both sides had promised to honor, was bombed and machine-gunned from the air and then overrun by German paratroops. Patients who were able to walk were driven out of their beds. Staff and wounded alike were herded together and marched off towards Galatas in the direction of the fighting rather than away from it, prisoners of an army that had just violated the one document supposedly protecting them. For the New Zealanders of the nearby field ambulance, forced to watch their own hospital's patients marched off under guard, the sight would have been almost impossible to process. This was not the war they had trained for. This was the war they had been promised, by treaty and by custom, would never happen to the wounded. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It genuinely makes a difference to a channel this size. It would be easy and in some ways comforting to treat this as a uniquely German failing, a specifically Nazi contempt for international law. The historical record does not support quite so simple a story. Deliberate or careless violations of protected medical status happened on more than one side, in more than one theater, throughout the Second World War, and the Allies were not perfectly innocent of exploiting the protections of the Red Cross for military advantage either, even if the scale bore no comparison to the atrocities committed under Axis occupation. What made Crete distinctive was the sheer visibility of the breach. This was not a matter of an isolated ambulance caught in crossfire on a confused battlefield, where accident is a plausible explanation. This was a large, clearly marked medical area with crosses painted on rooftops and staked out on open ground precisely so that it would be seen from the air. attacked and then physically occupied by ground troops who marched captive medical patients away from the site. German commanders elsewhere in the war would, at times, respect medical markings scrupulously, particularly on the Western Front later in the conflict, where reciprocity and the presence of neutral observers made violations costlier. In the desperate, fast-moving opening hours of an airborne assault on an island Germany had badly underestimated, those restraints evidently gave way. The immediate operational effect of the attack was limited. New Zealand riflemen from the nearby field ambulance area, along with small counterthrusts from units still capable of organized resistance, made the German position around the captured hospital precarious, and the paratroopers who had seized it found themselves clinging to ground under sniper fire rather than consolidating a secure rear area. In that narrow tactical sense, the assault on the hospital gained the attackers very little, but its psychological and diplomatic impact ran far deeper than the ground it changed hands over. Word of what had happened spread quickly among Commonwealth troops on Crete, and it hardened an already brutal fight into something closer to a war without quarter in places. Cretan civilians, who would go on to wage one of the most ferocious guerrilla resistances of the entire war against German occupation, absorbed these stories into a well of anger that fueled years of partisan violence long after the formal battle for the island had ended. Whatever restraint either side might have shown to the other in the opening hours of the invasion had, by nightfall on May 20th, been badly eroded. For the captured patients and staff marched away from the hospital towards Galatas, the ordeal was a further, deeply personal violation layered on top of whatever wound or illness had put them in that hospital bed in the first place. Men who had been pulled from the fighting, expecting the protection that international law promised them, found themselves prisoners within hours, marched under guard through a battle that was still raging around them, some of them barely able to walk without assistance. The 6th New Zealand Field Ambulance, positioned nearby, absorbed staff and casualties fleeing the collapse of the hospital area, and its own personnel found themselves drawn into a defensive fight they had never trained or expected to conduct, treating the wounded with one hand and, in places, taking up arms with the other. It is this improvised, desperate defense of a medical position, waged by men whose Red Cross brassards had just failed to protect the unit next door, that gives the episode its particular bitter edge. It is important to be honest about the limits of what can be firmly established here. Battlefield chaos does not lend itself to tidy documentation and accounts of exactly what individual German soldiers believed or were ordered to do when they overran the hospital area have not survived in the kind of detail that would allow a court or a historian to reconstruct intent with certainty. What is well attested from multiple accounts on the Allied side and accepted in the post-war historical record is the sequence of events themselves. The marking, the bombing, the ground assault, and the marching away of patients and staff. Whether this was the result of a specific order, a failure of German aerial reconnaissance to properly identify the site before the attack, or simply the collapse of restraint among exhausted, embattled paratroopers who had just suffered horrific casualties, remains genuinely open to interpretation, and honest historians have differed on where the balance of responsibility lies. Set against other theaters of the war, the Crete hospital attack sits within a much wider and grimmer pattern. German forces would go on to commit far more systematic and deliberate violations of medical protection on the Eastern Front, where the laws of war were treated by the Nazi leadership as essentially inapplicable to the Soviet enemy from the outset. By comparison, the treatment of Allied medical facilities in Western Europe and the Mediterranean, while far from perfect, generally involved fewer and less flagrant breaches, in part because German commanders in those theaters had greater incentive to preserve reciprocal protections for their own wounded and medical personnel, who might just as easily fall into Allied hands. American and British forces, for their part, occasionally faced accusations of positioning military assets too close to marked medical facilities, blurring lines that the Geneva Convention required to be kept sharply distinct, though nothing on the scale or clarity of the Canea assault has ever been credibly alleged against Commonwealth forces on Crete. The comparison, in other words, is not one of moral equivalence, but of degree. And Crete stands as an early, prominent example of a protection that would be tested again and again with wildly varying degrees of respect across the rest of the war. The longer legacy of what happened at the 7th General Hospital is harder to measure than a body count or a map reference, but it is no less real for that. It became, alongside the wider brutality of the Crete campaign, part of the evidence base that shaped how the post-war world thought about the adequacy of the 1929 Geneva Convention itself. The updated and expanded Geneva Conventions of 1949, still the foundation of international humanitarian law today, were drafted by men who had lived through a war in which markings meant to guarantee safety had, time and again, failed to do so, whether through accident, chaos, or deliberate contempt. The story of Crete's violated hospital is a small thread in that much larger tapestry, but it is a telling one, precisely because the marking was so clear and the breach so visible. There was no fog of confusion about where the crosses had been painted. The argument, then and now, has always been about what happened after they were seen. Nothing physical remains today to mark the exact spot where the 7th General Hospital stood outside Canea. The tents and marquees of a temporary wartime hospital leave no ruins for a visitor to walk through. But the wider battlefield around Malem, Galatas, and Canea is scattered with memorials, war cemeteries, and museum collections that preserve the memory of what happened on Crete in those 11 days of May 1941, including the German war cemetery at Malem, where thousands of the paratroopers who fell in the invasion, including many who took part in the fighting around the hospital, now lie buried within sight of the airfield they died trying to take. Return for a moment to that morning. The dust still hanging over the olive groves, the white cloth staked out on the ground, exactly as the rules required, exactly as it was supposed to work. A symbol is only as strong as the willingness of armies to honor it, and on May 20th, 1941, on a strip of Cretan coastline that most of the men fighting there had never heard of before that spring, the symbol was not honored. Patients who should have been safe were marched into captivity. Orderlies who should have been tending the wounded found themselves reaching for rifles. And an army that had signed its name to a promise in 1934 broke that promise within the first hours of an invasion it had not expected to be so costly. What was achieved, in the narrowest military sense, by overrunning a hospital was almost nothing. The ground gained was thin and quickly contested. The tactical advantage was fleeting. What was lost was something that could not be measured in ground held or casualties inflicted. The fragile, always imperfect understanding that some places and some people were meant to stand outside the killing. Crete did not invent the violation of that understanding, and it would not be the last time in the war that a red cross on a white field failed to stop the bombs from falling. But it stands, starkly and clearly documented, as a warning of how quickly the rules can vanish once an army decides that survival matters more than the promises it made on paper. The wounded of the 7th General Hospital learned that lesson at first hand on a May morning on Crete when the one symbol meant to keep them safe simply stopped working.